CEO goes undercover as a homeless man. His own employees' reactions will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, tell us, how do you think your boss would react if a homeless person walked into your workplace? Comment below. And if you love stories with shocking twists, hit that subscribe button. We post every day. Graham Sinclair's heart pounded as he stood just outside the sleek glass doors of Sinclair Enterprises. The morning sun cast a harsh glare on the building's polished facade, but he barely noticed the brightness. He traded his usual tailored suit for tattered jeans, worn sneakers, and an old hoodie that smelled faintly of damp cardboard. Immediately, he felt how differently the world treated him in this disguise. A security guard eyed him, probably assuming he was a vagrant looking for a handout, and an intern walking by gave him a wide berth, muttering under her breath about that homeless guy. That was his first red flag. Employees who looked right through him, as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. Instead of stepping inside confidently as the CEO, he hesitated by the entrance, feeling a cocktail of anxiety and curiosity. Could his own workforce be so dismissive, so unkind? He wasn't used to this kind of apprehension, but he promised himself he would see the raw, unfiltered truth of how his people treated those they considered beneath them. Graham ran his fingers along the hood's frayed edge, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The lobby was all marble floors, modern art, and carefully curated lighting. Behind the reception desk, a young man in a crisp suit was chatting on the phone. Graham cleared his throat, stepping forward. The receptionist glanced up, sighed, and continued his call as if Graham were invisible. Graham waited. 40 seconds passed, then a full minute. Finally, the man hung up. "Can I help you?" he said in a monotone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Graham tried to keep his voice steady, though the adrenaline surged. "I'm looking for the hiring department," he said quietly, hoping the trembling in his voice wouldn't betray him. The receptionist frowned. "We don't have walk-in interviews," he replied curtly. He leaned forward, scanning Graham's face. "Maybe you should try a local shelter or the job center downtown." Another red flag. Graham forced a smile. "I heard you're looking for temp workers. Thought I'd give it a shot." The receptionist shrugged. "If you don't have an appointment, I can't help you." Then, clearly done with the conversation, he looked down at his paperwork. Graham stepped back, feeling the sting of rejection. He'd always believed that kindness was a core value of his company, but the tension he sensed in the lobby alone suggested otherwise. As he walked deeper into the building, he noticed employees hustling to and fro, each person occupied with their own agendas. No one paused to ask if he needed help or directions. A few even recoiled at him. He walked along a corridor lined with motivational posters about teamwork and respect, each slogan feeling like a hollow echo of what he'd experienced so far. Passing a break room, he caught a glimpse of employees laughing, sipping coffee, and joking about how the lobby hobo had probably wandered in off the street to beg for money. Graham's chest tightened. He had expected some form of dismissal, but the venom in their tone was jarring. Gathering his resolve, he pressed on, determined to reach the Human Resources Department. He'd built this company from the ground up, priding himself on a culture of empathy. Clearly, somewhere along the line, that culture had been corrupted. As he moved deeper into the maze of cubicles, he felt like an unwelcome specter, heads turning away, hushed whispers following him. Then, another red flag. A manager in a tailored blazer actually sneered at him before telling him to clear out if he knew what was good for him. The man's name badge read Robert Tate, General Manager. Tate was a recent hire, brought in to boost productivity. Graham had never met him in person before. This was their first encounter, under bizarre circumstances. The hostility in Tate's eyes was unmistakable, and a flicker of concern crossed Graham's mind. Is this how Tate treated everyone beneath him? Still, Graham feigned ignorance, lowering his gaze and muttering that he was just looking for a job application. Tate let out a scoff. "We're not a charity. Get lost." With that, the manager spun on his heel and strode off. Graham exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to blow his cover. He wondered if any of the employees watching would step in, but no one did. One woman briefly locked eyes with him, her expression a mix of pity and apprehension, but she glanced away just as quickly. Feeling a pang of disappointment, Graham finally found a sign that read Human Resources near the far end of the hallway. He approached the door, but it was locked. Through the small glass window, he saw two staff members talking, one of them gesturing animatedly. He knocked, a polite, gentle tap. The conversation inside continued without pause. He knocked again, more firmly this time. Finally, a stern-looking woman opened the door just enough to peer out. "Yes?" she said, scanning him up and down with undisguised disapproval. Graham explained that he was hoping to apply for any available position, janitorial, mailroom, anything. The woman pursed her lips and shook her head. "We do everything online now. If you don't have a computer, use the public library. We're busy." And with that, she shut the door in his face. Graham was left staring at the wood grain, his pulse thumping with a mix of hurt and anger. He could sense the employees behind that door resuming their conversation as if nothing significant had happened. Resolved to continue his undercover mission, Graham took a few steps back, looking around at the rows of cubicles, wondering why. He soon realized he couldn't simply stand there in the corridor forever. He needed to see the day-to-day reality of employees under this oppressive atmosphere, so he started wandering around, careful to avoid drawing too much attention. Whenever a staff member looked at him, it was as though they were assessing a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. His throat tightened every time someone shot him a withering glance, but he pressed on, hoping for just one spark of empathy. Eventually, he noticed an older woman carrying a stack of files precariously high, her face strained with the effort. Her name tag read Sarah. While others rushed by without offering help, Graham stepped forward. "Do you need a hand?" he asked gently, adopting the timid, subdued tone he'd been using since he first walked in. Sarah paused, eyes darting across his ragged clothes. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse his help purely because of his appearance. Then she sighed. "Sure," she murmured, offloading half the stack into Graham's arms. They walked down a narrow hallway together in tense silence. When they reached her destination, a cramped records room, she shot him a curious glance. "You're not an employee here, are you?" Graham shook his head. "Just looking for work. HR wouldn't see me." Sarah grimaced. "They don't see a lot of people these days." As she set the files down, she hesitated. "Look, I can't promise anything, but if you come by later, I might be able to point you to a manager who's less strict." She carefully avoided Tate's name, but Graham sensed that she was aware of how things really worked around here. He nodded, thanking her. The hint of warmth in her expression gave him a small jolt of hope. Maybe not everyone was indifferent. He slipped away before she could ask more questions about who he really was. Further down the corridor, he found a dimly lit stairwell that led to the lower levels. The overhead lights flickered ominously, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. He heard the distant hum of machinery, likely the building's HVAC system. Pushing open a heavy metal door, he found himself in a maintenance corridor. Tall shelves filled with janitorial supplies loomed along the walls. A single figure stood hunched near a mop bucket, scrubbing a stubborn stain. Graham approached carefully, not wanting to startle him. The man turned, revealing a name patch on his uniform, Miguel. He looked up, eyes tired but kind. For the first time since entering the building, Graham felt genuine warmth directed his way. "Need something?" Miguel asked, setting the mop aside. Graham paused, stumbling over his words. Well, HR turned me away. I was hoping maybe I could ask if they're hiring for the maintenance department." "I'll do anything." Miguel studied him for a moment, took in the threadbare hoodie and worn shoes, and seemed to make a decision. Reaching into a small cooler by the wall, he pulled out a wrap sandwich. "Here," he said quietly. "You look hungry." Graham's stomach growled at the sight of real food. He accepted it with shaking hands, his gratitude too strong to hide. Without thinking, he asked, "Aren't you worried you'll get in trouble for giving this to me?" Miguel shrugged, eyes downcast. "I only got half an hour left on my shift. If anyone complains, I'll say I was throwing it away. They don't really pay attention to us down here. Graham felt a wave of conflicting emotions. This man, overlooked by the company's higher-ups, was showing him more compassion than any manager had so far. As he bit into the sandwich, he wondered how many other workers like Miguel existed here, people whose kindness was stifled by a culture of fear and detachment. When he finished, Graham tried to give back what little remained, but Miguel shook his head. "Keep it," he insisted. "I got more upstairs." Then, as if remembering the possibility of being overheard, he lowered his voice. "Don't let Tate see you. He's got a thing about unwanted visitors. I've seen him make folks cry, okay?" Nodding, Graham reassured him that he'd be careful. Before he slipped back into the corridor, he turned and quietly said, "Thank you, Miguel. You'll never know how much this means." The janitor smiled faintly, returning to his mop bucket without another word. Graham stood alone for a moment, sandwich in hand, reflecting on the stark difference between the coldness upstairs and the compassion shown by this one employee in a basement corridor. It was a glimmer of humanity in an otherwise hostile environment. He was more determined than ever to peel back the layers of his own organization and find out exactly where things had gone wrong. He made his way back upstairs, careful to duck into empty hallways whenever he heard voices approaching. By now, he could practically feel the tension radiating from the walls. It was as if everyone was on edge, hyper-focused on meeting some invisible quota or keeping in line with draconian policies. Re-emerging near the main lobby, he spotted Robert Tate again, this time speaking to a small group of employees. Tate's voice was loud, echoing against the marble floor. "And if you don't like how we do things, there's the door. We don't need slackers." One of the employees, a young man with nervous eyes, looked ready to burst into tears. Tate dismissed the group with a sharp gesture, and they scattered like frightened mice. Graham lingered behind a potted plant, observing. Tate stood there for a moment, his lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk, before strutting off down the hallway. It was infuriating to watch. Graham wondered how many times Tate had acted this way without consequence. He silently vowed that by the end of this day, Tate's reign of intimidation would be over. Still, he had to keep his disguise intact for now. Determined to see the practical side of the company, Graham headed toward the shipping and receiving area. Beyond another set of heavy doors, he found a bustling room where workers sorted and labeled boxes under fluorescent lights. The air smelled of cardboard and tape. Nobody noticed him at first, until he tried to help someone lift a heavy package. A tall, broad-shouldered man scowled at him, suspicious. "You authorized to be in here?" Graham raised his hands defensively. "Just trying to help." The man shook his head. "I don't know you. If Tate finds out we got a random stranger messing with shipments, he'll have our heads." Lowering his voice, he added, "You should really leave, for your own sake." Another worker, a weary-looking woman, gave a small nod. "He's right. This place is run on fear." "Sorry." Graham sighed, stepping away. He noticed how subdued everyone was, like they were bracing themselves for a sudden crackdown. Was this what his company had come to? Back when he'd founded Sinclair Enterprises, he wanted an environment where employees felt valued and secure. The scene before him was the polar opposite. Turning away from shipping and receiving, he headed down a side corridor he'd never seen. The decor was stark, the paint peeling in places. It was clear that no one bothered to maintain these less visible corners of the building. He glanced into a few offices with open doors, seeing anxious faces bent over desks piled high with paperwork. The gloom was palpable. Suddenly, he heard a heated argument from behind a closed door. Pressing his ear against it, he recognized Sarah's voice, the woman who'd let him help her with the files earlier. "But he's just trying to apply," she was saying. "What's the harm?" A second voice, sharp and irritated, snapped back. "Company policy is no walk-ins. Why are you wasting your time with that? We can't fix every sob story that wanders in." Sarah let out an exasperated sigh. "I'm not saying we hire him on the spot. I'm saying maybe we point him to a manager who isn't so quick to slam a door in his face." "And who's that supposed to be?" the other person retorted. Because last time I checked, Tate has final say. Silence fell. Graham's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, even in private. Carefully, he moved away from the door, not wanting to get Sarah in trouble for defending a homeless stranger. It was comforting to know there were a few employees who hadn't lost their humanity. But it was also terrifying that they seemed so powerless against the entrenched attitudes. As he wandered back toward the lobby, Graham noticed Tate across the room, barking orders at a cluster of junior employees. The man practically radiated hostility, moving from one person to the next, berating them for minor errors. A single sheet of paper out of place earned a biting remark. A single misfiled document prompted threats of disciplinary action. Graham's hands clenched at his sides. This was more than just a rough manager. This was a toxic tyrant ruling through fear. He'd seen enough. Before confronting Tate, he needed to gather clear evidence of how thoroughly this culture had permeated the company. He would continue to observe, then make his move. Deciding the cafeteria might offer more insights, Graham headed there next. Stepping into the large, open space, he was greeted by the clamor of employees standing in line for cafeteria food. The smell of reheated pasta and burnt coffee hung in the air. Clutching the last bit of Miguel's sandwich in his pocket, Graham approached the serving counter, where a bored-looking server eyed him warily. "Got any spare soup or anything?" he asked quietly, trying not to draw attention. The server's lip curled. "We don't do freebies," she snapped. "You paying or not?" Graham patted his pockets theatrically. "I left my wallet in my car." "I was hoping—" She cut him off. "Then you better go get it." The impatience in her voice made several employees turn around. One man laughed openly, pointing at Graham's hoodie as if that alone confirmed he had no money. Another called out, "He's not a customer, he's just loitering." Feeling multiple eyes on him, Graham mumbled an apology and backed away. He scanned the cafeteria, spying Sarah at a corner table, nibbling on a salad, her eyes darting toward the bustling lines. Mustering some courage, he walked over and quietly asked if he could sit. She hesitated, but gestured for him to take a seat across from her. She seemed uneasy, as if worried about being seen with him. "Did you get into CHR?" she asked, her tone low. Graham shook his head. "Locked door. No dice." She sighed. "I thought so." He leaned in. "Thank you for trying to help me earlier. It means a lot." She looked down at her fork. "I just couldn't stand there and watch you get turned away. It's been like this around here ever since the upper management changed. People are scared. Some of us remember when things were different." Graham's heart sank. "Different how?" She gave a sad little shrug. "We used to have an open-door policy, flexible hours, a real sense of community. But then a bunch of new policies came down the pipeline, strict quotas, fewer breaks, all that. People are expected to be machines, not human beings. And if you complain, guess who shows up at your desk? Tate." Graham feigned ignorance, trying to keep his cover. "What about the CEO? Surely he wouldn't want this." Sarah's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Mr. Sinclair? He hasn't been seen on site in months. Word is, he's too busy making deals. Or maybe he doesn't care. I don't know. Some say he's just another corporate big shot." Hearing those words stung. Graham kept his face neutral, but inside, a storm of guilt brewed. This was his fault. He'd allowed the culture to degrade by not keeping a closer eye on how policies were implemented. And now people like Sarah were paying the price. Before he could respond, a shadow fell across the table. Robert Tate stood there, arms crossed, glaring at Sarah. "What is this, a charity banquet? Why are you sitting with him?" Sarah's cheeks flushed. "I was just taking my break." Tate's gaze shifted to Graham, eyes full of contempt. "You again? Didn't I tell you to get lost?" Graham stared down at the table, quietly clenching his fists. He had to bite his tongue to keep from revealing himself right then. Sarah, visibly shaking, grabbed her tray and mumbled something about needing to get back to work. Tate loomed over Graham. This isn't a shelter. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave now. Graham rose slowly, giving Tate a long, steady look. Maybe I will, he said softly. But maybe I won't. Tate scoffed. Do I need to call security? Graham, still maintaining his facade, shrugged and headed for the door, feeling Tate's stare boring into his back. Once outside the cafeteria, Graham leaned against the wall, heart racing. He was furious that his people, his own employees, were subjected to this. No wonder morale was so low. The question was, how many others felt trapped and voiceless, and what could he do in one day to fix this? One thing was certain, the gloves would have to come off soon. He slipped outside to catch a breath of fresh air, stepping into a small courtyard normally used for employee breaks. The sky above was overcast, fitting the dark mood inside the building. A lone figure sat on a bench, hunched over a phone. As Graham approached, he realized it was Emily, one of the junior staff members who had scurried away under Tate's harsh words. She looked up, startled by his ragged appearance, but didn't immediately recoil. Taking it as a hopeful sign, he offered a tentative smile. Mind if I sit? She shook her head, sliding over to give him space. He sat down, noticing the faint tremor in her hands. Long day? He asked. She huffed a humorless laugh. You could say that. I just got chewed out by Tate for sending a report 10 minutes late. Not like the world was ending, but apparently it's a fireable offense now. Graham tilted his head. Does it always feel this hostile? Emily hesitated, glancing at him uncertainly. You're not an employee here, are you? I saw you in the cafeteria. Tate was about to blow a fuse. Graham thought carefully, then decided to be partially truthful. No, but I might be, if they ever let me apply. Emily stared at him for a moment, then her shoulders sagged. Well, good luck. This used to be a place where I felt proud to work. Now I'm anxious every morning before I even get out of bed. Everything's a performance metric. One slip up, and you're on probation or worse. She looked down, fiddling with a loose thread on her sleeve. I heard rumors it wasn't always like this. Graham nodded, encouraging her to continue. She bit her lip. I've only been here 6 months. At first, everyone was nice, especially the older staff who remembered the old Sinclair way. But then Tate came in. He made it his mission to weed out anyone he considered weak. People started quitting, or they got fired for small mistakes. Now the rest of us are just trying to keep our heads down. A wave of anger coursed through Graham, though he kept it off his face. Doesn't anyone complain to higher-ups? Emily shrugged. We don't even know who to complain to. Tate's got connections, apparently. HR's a joke. Sometimes I think about leaving, but I can't afford it. I need this job. Graham felt a surge of guilt, remembering how he'd always bragged about providing secure livelihoods. I'm sorry, he said gently. She gave him a curious look. Why are you apologizing? You're not the one terrorizing everyone. He stood up, trying to mask the emotions threatening to break through. Maybe I'll find a way to fix this, he murmured. Emily blinked in confusion as he turned to go. How? You're just a guy who can't even get an interview. He paused, forcing a faint smile. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what's really going on. She didn't respond, only watched as he headed back inside. Even that brief conversation had galvanized his resolve. Graham now had multiple testimonies pointing to the same root problem, Robert Tate. But how far did Tate's influence reach? Could he be operating under directives from other executives, or was he just a rogue manager drunk on power? Graham needed to find out before making his move. Another hour passed as he roamed the corridors, blending in as much as someone in shabby clothes could. He heard Tate's name invoked like a curse by some, a threat by others. At one point, he witnessed an argument where a mid-level manager threatened an employee with, "I'll tell Tate you're slacking." The employee quickly scurried back to work, pale-faced. By the time the clock struck mid-afternoon, Graham felt he had enough of an overview to confront the situation directly. He knew who his allies might be: Sarah, Emily, and Miguel, those who'd shown even a small amount of compassion or voiced dissatisfaction. More importantly, he recognized that a public confrontation was the only way to break this cycle of fear. And there was no better place for that than the main lobby, where everyone crossed paths. With a determined breath, he set off to find Tate once more, bracing himself for the final push. He found Tate exactly where he expected, striding through the lobby like he owned the place, occasionally snapping at employees who didn't greet him with sufficient enthusiasm. Graham waited near the entrance, leaning against the wall, biding his time. Finally, Tate's gaze fell upon him. The manager's face twisted into an ugly scowl. "You're still here?" he barked. Several employees nearby paused to watch. Graham didn't move, his eyes locked on Tate's. "I never got that interview," he said calmly, letting his voice carry. Tate snorted. "You think this is some charity? I told you to leave." Graham stepped forward, projecting a quiet confidence that clashed with his tattered appearance. "Why? Because you don't think a homeless man deserves a chance, or because you're afraid he might see what's really going on here?" A hush fell over the lobby. People turned in unison, alerted by the tension in Graham's voice. Tate's cheeks flushed with anger. "What did you say to me?" Graham took a slow breath. "I've walked these halls all day, and what I've seen is a culture of fear. People are terrified of stepping out of line. Is that how you run things?" Tate laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You don't know anything about this company. You're just a bum who doesn't belong here." At that, Miguel, who had just emerged from a service elevator, froze. Sarah stood at a distance, files in hand, while Emily hovered near the reception desk. Their eyes flicked between Graham and Tate, uncertain of what might happen next. Graham slowly pulled back his hood, revealing his face more clearly. Though still disguised with scruffy facial hair and dirt-smudged skin, there was a hint of authority in his features that made Tate pause. "I know enough," Graham continued, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I know that employees here are bullied daily. I know that your HR department slams the door on anyone who doesn't fit some perfect image. And I know that you, Robert Tate, have made yourself into a tyrant." Tate's nostrils flared. "You better watch your mouth, or what?" Graham challenged. "You'll fire me? Have me removed? Go ahead. Let everyone see how you handle an inconvenient truth." Murmurs spread through the growing crowd. Some employees crept closer, curiosity overcoming their fear. Tate glanced around, noticing the attention. He jabbed a finger in Graham's direction. "Security! Someone get this trespasser out of here!" 2 security guards approached, but their expressions were uncertain. They'd seen Graham all day, yes, but they also seemed confused by the confidence with which he spoke. One guard hesitated, looking at Tate as if to confirm instructions, but didn't immediately act. Graham, eyes never leaving Tate, raised his voice. "You think you can keep this hidden? People are miserable. They're scared. And all you do is threaten them. If the CEO knew about this..." Tate rolled his eyes. "Spare me the sob story. Sinclair is too busy counting his money to care." A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. Graham stood taller. "That's where you're wrong." His tone shifted, laced with a quiet, seething anger. "He's here, and he does care." For a split second, confusion crossed Tate's face. Then he sneered. "What are you talking about?" Graham reached into his pocket, withdrawing his phone, which bore the Sinclair Enterprises logo on its custom case. He held it up so everyone could see. Some employees gasped. "You want to call Mr. Sinclair?" Graham asked, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "Here's your chance." Tate blinked, struggling to piece things together. His bravado wavered. "What, is this some kind of joke?" Graham let out a bitter laugh. "No joke. I've had enough of watching you bully people." And with that, he pulled off the fake dirt from his face, wiping away the disguise. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Miguel's mop clattered to the floor, and Sarah dropped her files in shock. "My name," Graham said, eyes pinned on Tate, "is Graham Sinclair. And I'm the CEO of this company. A stunned silence filled the lobby. For a moment, it seemed like the entire building held its breath. Then chaos erupted. Whispers and gasps spread among the employees, some pressing hands to their mouths in disbelief, others looking at one another as though to verify they weren't dreaming. The security guards stepped back, eyes wide, unsure what to do next. Tate's face went white, then red, then white again, as if his body couldn't decide whether to flush with anger or drain from terror. He opened his mouth but no words came out. Graham took a step closer, harnessing a level, authoritative tone that reverberated across the lobby. You've made it your mission to intimidate and demean the people who work here. These are the very people who keep this company running, my company, Robert. Finally finding his voice, Tate stammered. I had no idea. If I'd known, you'd have treated me better? Graham cut in, voice ice cold. That's the problem. You only respect those you think can benefit you. Everyone else is expendable, right? Tate took a trembling step back, eyes flicking around for an escape route. But employees were circling closer, some furious, some relieved, all wanting to see how this confrontation would end. Sarah inched forward, tears glistening in her eyes. Emily hovered behind her, mouth slightly open, while Miguel watched from the back, a profound mix of disbelief and admiration on his face. Graham's gaze swept the crowd. I founded Sinclair Enterprises with a vision to create opportunity and foster respect. But in my absence, something went terribly wrong. He fixed his stare on Tate once more. People like you twisted that vision into a culture of fear. Tate shook his head wildly. I was just following policy. The new guidelines came from upstairs. I was implementing the targets. And did the guidelines also say to humiliate employees? To slam doors in the faces of potential applicants? To threaten people for minor mistakes? Graham's voice rose. Don't you dare blame policy for basic human decency. Or the lack thereof. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered employees. Tate glanced around, searching for support. He found none. The sane junior employees he terrorized now eyed him with grim satisfaction, and not one stepped forward to defend him. Look, we can work something out, Tate pleaded, desperation creeping in. I was only trying to keep the numbers up. Productivity is essential, and stop talking, Graham ordered, his patience gone. I've seen enough. The entire lobby fell silent again, the weight of judgment imminent. Graham pointed toward the exit. Security, he said quietly. Kindly escort Mr. Tate from the premises. Effective immediately, he is no longer employed by Sinclair Enterprises. The guards looked at each other, stunned. Then one cleared his throat and approached Tate hesitantly. Tate's eyes blazed with panic. You can't do this. I have a contract. I'll sue. Graham's expression didn't waver. You're welcome to try. But let the record show, there are plenty of witnesses to your misconduct. At that, Tate's shoulders sagged. He allowed himself to be led away by security, throwing one last venomous glare over his shoulder. The employees parted to let him pass, a wave of relief seeming to wash over them as he vanished through the glass doors. Once Tate was gone, all eyes turned to Graham. He could feel the press of their silent questions. What happens now? Would he punish them for their complicity or save them from it? Swallowing hard, he addressed the crowd. I know this is a shock. Many of you don't know me, and those who do probably thought I'd abandoned you. But I'm here to say that starts changing today. A flicker of hope lit up in Sarah's eyes, and Emily exhaled a trembling breath. Miguel leaned on his mop handle, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. Graham met their gazes one by one. We're going to have a meeting, everyone, together, to discuss how we fix what's broken. But first, I need each of you to know that what I saw today isn't what Sinclair Enterprises is meant to be. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. To those of you who showed kindness, to each other, to strangers, you're the heart of this company. Let's rebuild around that. A moment of stunned quiet lingered, then a wave of applause swept through the lobby. It began hesitantly, one or two claps uncertain, but quickly built into a crescendo of relief and triumph. Tears welled in the eyes of longtime employees, while newcomers breathed sighs of relief that the terror of Tate's regime was over. Graham raised a hand to quiet them. He knew the road ahead would be long and complicated. Firing Tate was only the first step in restoring a culture that had been eroded over months, if not years. Employees might still be wary, wondering if the next manager would be the same kind of tyrant. But for now, Graham wanted to assure them that real change was coming. Searching the faces in the crowd, he spotted Sarah, Emily, and Miguel gravitating toward one another as if drawn by the shared experience of surviving a toxic environment. Stepping away from the center of the lobby, Graham approached them. Emily looked nervous, while Sarah blinked away tears. Miguel gripped his mop, a bit overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Graham addressed Miguel first, voice low enough that only they could hear. "Thank you for your kindness. You offered me food when no one else would even look me in the eye. That says everything about who you are." Miguel's cheeks reddened slightly. "I just did what anyone should do." Graham smiled sadly. "Not everyone, as we saw." Then he turned to Sarah. "You spoke up for me. You told me you tried to direct me to someone more open-minded. That risked your own standing here." "Thank you." Sarah wiped her cheek. I couldn't stand by." Next, he looked at Emily. "You showed me a glimpse of what it's like for the newer hires, trying to survive under all this pressure. Thank you for being honest." Emily managed a small nod. "I thought you were just some guy looking for a job." "I was," Graham responded gently. "In a way, I still am, looking for a job as the CEO who deserves your trust." A fleeting smile tugged at her lips. Graham straightened, addressing the three of them. "If you're willing, I'd like you to help me in the coming days. I'll need people who understand what's been happening on the ground level." Miguel's eyes widened, Sarah's jaw dropped, and Emily breathed out a quiet, "Wow." Graham continued, "I can't fix this alone. I need voices from every corner, janitorial, administrative, new hires, veterans. We'll reorganize HR so it's not just a locked door. We'll set up an anonymous hotline for complaints. And we'll re-establish the open-door policy, starting today." Just then, a ripple in the crowd caught his eye. A group of senior managers had entered the lobby, drawn by the noise. Some looked apprehensive, others appeared cautiously optimistic. Graham's voice rose once more, addressing them, too. "We're all a part of this company's future. If you're willing to uphold the values we once had, respect, empathy, innovation, then we'll move forward together. If not, you might want to follow Tate out the door." A few managers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Graham sensed the real conversations would happen behind closed doors in the next few days. But at least the facade had been broken. The old illusions of absolute power under Tate's tyranny were shattered in a single, public moment. Sarah, Emily, and Miguel each took a small step closer, as if drawn by a collective sense of hope. Graham rested a hand on Miguel's shoulder, remembering how that single act of kindness had sparked his determination to confront this mess. "Thank you," he said again, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all." With that, the tension in the lobby softened into a mixture of relief and anticipation. People began to disperse, heading back to their stations, not in fear this time but with a renewed sense that tomorrow could actually be different. For the first time all day, Graham felt like he could breathe. He lingered in the lobby as the crowd thinned, taking in the remnants of the tense scene. A few employees remained, whispering among themselves, casting glances his way. No one was quite sure what to do next, but the atmosphere had undeniably shifted. Graham exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He'd come here disguised to uncover the truth, and he'd found more than he bargained for, an entire company culture on the brink of collapse under toxic leadership. Though he'd ousted Tate, the real work was just beginning. He strolled over to the main reception desk, where the same receptionist who'd ignored him at the start of the day now stood frozen in place. The man's complexion had gone pale. Clearly, he'd witnessed the entire confrontation. Graham offered a faint smile. "You can breathe, you know." The receptionist managed a weak chuckle. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sinclair." I didn't realize it was you. Graham didn't let him off the hook that easily. And if I'd been just another person looking for a job, would you have treated me any differently? The receptionist's gaze fell. I guess not. That's what we need to change, Graham said softly. I don't blame you alone. This culture has seeped into every corner of the building. The receptionist nodded, relief mingled with shame. I'll do better. Let's make it a team effort, Graham replied. Then, giving him a gentle pat on the shoulder, he turned and headed toward the exit doors. He paused, remembering Sarah's remark about how Mr. Sinclair hasn't been seen on site in months. This was his first real visit in a long time, and it had taken going undercover for him to see what was happening. That realization weighed heavily on him. He pushed open the doors, stepping onto the sidewalk outside. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. A day ago, he'd walked in wearing rags, feeling apprehensive and curious. Now, he stood there with a renewed sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about terminating one bad manager. It was about rebuilding trust across all levels. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a flood of messages from executive team members who'd just heard of the showdown. Some were supportive, while others were panicked, worried about liability or public relations. One in particular stood out. It was from a board member praising him for taking decisive action. Graham grimaced slightly. Decisive action was all well and good, but if the board had truly been paying attention, would it have come to this? He slipped the phone back into his pocket. For now, he had to focus on the people who formed the backbone of Sinclair Enterprises. Those who cleaned the floors, answered the phones, sorted the shipments, managed the files, and kept the entire operation alive. Turning to glance back at the glass facade of the building, he saw a reflection of himself, no longer in tatters, but still carrying the weight of what he'd learned. This place was worth saving, but only if he committed to being present, to listening, and to ensuring no one else rose to power with the same destructive mindset as Tate. He took a deep breath of the evening air, then headed back inside, determined to have that immediate all-hands meeting he'd promised. He asked the receptionist, now looking eager to please, to send out a building-wide announcement. Everyone was to gather in the main conference hall within the hour. Graham spent the next few minutes checking in on Sarah, Emily, and Miguel, inviting them personally to sit up front, so employees could see that decency and compassion would be recognized, not penalized. When the hour arrived, the main conference hall filled to capacity. People were still buzzing from the day's drama. Graham stood at the podium, scanning the sea of faces, some nervous, some hopeful, many exhausted from months of tension. He cleared his throat. I won't keep you long. I know this has been an eventful day. But you all deserve to hear this directly from me. Sinclair Enterprises is going to change. A hush fell over the crowd. Graham continued. When I first started this company, I envisioned a place where people could thrive, where we'd innovate and grow together. Somewhere along the line, that vision was lost. Policies got twisted, and people were replaced by metrics. But no more. He lifted his gaze, letting it roam the room. I saw, firsthand, how fear has taken hold. I saw doors slammed in my face when I appeared as someone who just needed a chance. That can't continue. He gestured to Sarah, Emily, and Miguel in the front row. These three reminded me what Sinclair Enterprises was supposed to be about: helping, caring, showing basic human respect. Starting today, we're going to rebuild that. He announced immediate steps: the dissolution of the old HR protocol, the reinstatement of open-door policies, and a temporary freeze on performance metrics until a new, more humane system could be implemented. There were murmurs of surprise and relief. Graham added, I want to hear from you. All of you. If you have ideas, concerns, or issues, my door will be open. He paused. And yes, I literally mean my door. I will be on site. I'm not going to vanish again. Applause broke out, hesitant at first but then swelling. Graham smiled, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the spark of hope. He stepped down from the podium, and for the next hour, employees, some shaking, others tearful, lined up to share brief stories of how they had been mistreated or ignored. Graham listened intently, occasionally taking notes. Every so often, he caught sight of Sarah or Emily or Miguel in the crowd, giving him encouraging nods. By the time the meeting ended, the sky outside was fully dark. Employees filtered out, voices animated with a mix of relief and cautious optimism. Sarah came up to him with shining eyes. "Thank you? I can't believe this is happening." Emily and Miguel joined them, wearing similar expressions of disbelief. Graham folded his arms, looking between them. "It's just the first step. There's a lot of work to do." Miguel gripped his mop as though it were a staff. "If you need help, I'm in," he said simply. Emily agreed, a new confidence in her voice. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill over. Graham gave them a grateful smile. "We're in this together. Thank you for reminding me why I started this company in the first place." With that, they parted ways for the night, each going home with the events of the day swirling in their minds. Graham lingered behind, making a few calls, ensuring Tate's dismissal paperwork was finalized, and instructing HR to extend the hours for employees who might want to speak privately. He then walked through the now empty corridors, the overhead lights dim, a faint hum of air conditioning in the background. The building felt different, lighter, as if the oppressive tension had lifted, even if only slightly. Pausing in front of a large window that overlooked the city, Graham reflected on the day's revelations. He'd disguised himself as a homeless man to test his employees, but the real test had been his own willingness to confront the damage done in his name. He promised himself, then and there, never again to be so distant that people like Tate could thrive unchecked. Tomorrow, he'd start drafting new policies with the help of those who understood the ground realities best. He'd set up a direct feedback channel. He'd personally review each department's leadership. And most importantly, he'd walk these halls regularly, no more leaving it to chance. As he turned to leave, the faint reflection in the glass showed a man resolved, no longer weighed down by uncertainty. The day had ended in a confrontation that was both humiliating for the tyrant and liberating for the staff. Graham realized that, for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future of his own company. With a determined nod, he headed home, already envisioning the next steps in rebuilding Sinclair Enterprises from the inside out. He vowed that never again would he have to go undercover just to see the truth. After all, from this moment on, the doors would be open to everyone.